Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the fourth video in the video series that covers creating a web application with AWS Serverless framework. So in this video, I'm going to cover API gateway. So in the last couple of videos, we saw hosting the website using S3 static websites. Then in the next video, we saw how Lambda works, how we can use Lambda as our backend code to add the business logic. Now in this video, we'll see how API gateway works to expose APIs and how we can integrate Lambda that we had seen in the last video with the API gateway so that our UI code can call that API and get the response from our backend code. Go to the API gateway service in the AWS console. I have already created an API that gets used in the web application that we have been seeing so far. But to demo the API gateway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new test API and I'm going to show you how it works. So once you are on this page, click on Create API and we are going to create a new API. Let's call it My API. And let's just keep the endpoint as regional and click on Create API. Now once the API is created, you will see that it does not have any resources or methods by default, and you can see it just has slash by default. And you can also see there are no stages currently. So stages are more like environments. So when you create an API, you can deploy it into one of many stages. So for example, a stage can be a dev stage or a QA stage or a prod stage, and we will see that in some time. Right. So for now, let's go back to our API, and here you can see there's just a slash. So what we'll do next is we'll create a resource. Now resource is a URL. So let's just say test 123, and you can see it automatically creates a resource path for you, which is okay. And let's just click on create resource. Now once that is done, you can see that a resource is created with this particular method. Now once that resource is created, we need to define a method, right? And by method, I mean whether it's a get request, a post request, or a put request, right? So to do that, click on your resource that you have created, click on action and click on create method. And now in the drop down, let's just go ahead and select get and select yes. Now once that is done, you will get an option to select the integration, what you want to do when this API gets invoked. So it could either be a Lambda function, it could be HTTP, it could be mock, it could be any other AWS service, etc, etc. So let's just try to do a Lambda function integration right now. And what we will do is we'll go ahead and use my test 103. Now if you remember from our last video tutorial, we created this Lambda just to show how Lambda works, and it replied a response saying hello from Lambda from OSFG. So let's go ahead and save this, and it will ask you if you want to give API gateway permission to invoke this Lambda. I will go ahead and say okay, and your integration should be successful. And once that is done, you will get the screen in which you will see that this is the method request, this is the integration request, this is the Lambda that you invoke, and this is the response flow. Now if you want to test it, you can just click on this test and you can just go ahead and say test. And in the response, you can see hello from Lambda from OSFG. Now this is the same thing that we had added in the Lambda in our last video. So this is the same thing that we are getting, right? So we have essentially created a new API. We created a resource, we added a get method in it, and we have successfully tested it out, right? Now this is just for testing part. Now if you want to go ahead and deploy it so that you can access it from the internet, what you need to do is click on action and select deploy API. Now like I said before, when you deploy API, you can deploy it in one of the stages. As we have created this API right now, there are no stages associated with it, so I'm going to click new stage and let's just call it dev, and I'm going to say deploy. Now once you have deployed, you can go to stages and you can see that there is a dev stage that is created, and it is here where you can see that there is a URL that you can hit. Now when you hit this URL that corresponds to the dev stage, it will automatically go ahead and call the Lambda proxy that we had just set some time back. So to test this out, you can just open this into a new tab and you can see that it should work. So let's just add our resource to it, and you can see that it says hello world from lambda from OSFG. And this is because we have defined a get resource for this, and that's why this is working fine. So let's go back to our resources and just see what we have done so far. So we created API, then we created a resource, we called it test123, and then we created a method for get, and then we just created a lambda integration for it, which calls my test lambda 103, and it replies with the response that is sent by the lambda, right? So now let's go back to our API gateway and let's see what we did with our actual lambda. So if you see this lambda, we have slash and then we have a resource called bucket. Now if you see the way it is structured, that it has a bucket in the curly braces, that means it's a path parameter, right? So if you go back to our code and look at the script that calls this API, it basically says this is your API gateway URL and then a bucket name. So this is the base URL of the API gateway and bucket name is the path parameter. So if you come back here, this is the bucket that it gets mapped to, right? And once that gets mapped to a path, it will send to the lambda fetch S3 data that we saw in the last video, and then it will process the request. It will get all the files in the S3 corresponding to this particular bucket and send all the response back to the lambda, right? One more important thing that we want to know here is the CORS. So what is CORS, right? So CORS is basically cross origin resource sharing. So let's say your website is hosted in www.opensourceforgeeks.com, and then you're making an API call to some S3 bucket which is in different domain than opensourceforgeeks.com, then that request is by default denied by a browser, right? And if you want to make a cross-domain request from your website, then you need to turn on CORS for that particular API, right? And that's why you can see we have turned on CORS for this particular API. And to do that, you can simply select your resource. You can click action and you can select enable CORS. And once you do that, you can simply select enable CORS and replace existing CORS headers. It will just go ahead and add an option value and the CORS should be set, right? And again, as I said, you can test this out. To test this out, click on test and you can see that this is the get method that we are testing. In the bucket, we will simply copy the bucket name that we are using, which is core test. Let's go back here, paste it here, and then click on test. And this should go to lambda and give us the response. There we go. This is the same response that we saw in our serverless app. So again, let's take a quick look at it. So go to network tab and click on fetch list, and this should first make an options call, which is this that hits this particular method, and then you have get, which basically hits the get method of the resource, and the response is again status code 200 and body, which is same as what we saw in the test, right? That's the same response that we get, right? So finally, let's see how we have deployed this API. Like I said before, once you have created an API, you have created an resource, and you have created a method. In order to deploy, just click on actions, select on deploy API, and I have already created two stages for this particular API. So just click on dev and say deploy, and this should automatically get deployed and take you to the dev stage, and this is how it looks like. So you can see this is the invoke URL that AWS provides you. So if you just copy this and try to search it in this particular file, you can see that this is the same URL that we are making AJAX call to, and bucket name is nothing but the resource name that we have created under this particular API, right? And again, similarly, you can do for a QA stage as well, but for demo purposes, I'm using dev, right? So that's how API gateway works. So a couple of other things that you would need to understand in terms of API gateway. One is stage variable, and another is seeing the logs in the CloudWatch corresponding to the API gateway. So the stage variables are more like configuration variables which you can use at runtime in the API gateway For example, you can use stage variables to call a particular alias of the Lambda, right? So I have created a separate video to explain how stage variables works. So you can take a look at my channel, and there you can see that there is a video which says how to use API gateway stage variables to call Lambda, right? So you can take a look at that video. The next thing that I wanted to show is logs. So to enable logs, you need to go to settings and you need to give a role ARN that lets API gateway send logs to CloudWatch, right? And if you go to CloudWatch, you should be able to see logs corresponding to this API. And let's quickly go there, go to logs, and you can see that there is API gateway execution logs, and this is the API ID. So if you go back here to the API gateway, let's go to my test API, go to stages, and let's click on dev, and you can see the IV8Z thing. That's the API gateway ID, and that is the same thing that you see here, right? So this corresponds to the dev stage, and this corresponds to the QA stage, right? And again, I'm not going to go over what actually goes here, why it goes here, what is the IAM role that corresponds to it. Again, I have a separate video that I had recorded to show the same. Again, you can go to my channel and you can see how to enable CloudWatch logs for APIs in API gateway. And these two videos should help you understand how logs and stage variables work, but we do not need this for this demo. One last thing that I want to tell you is about custom domain names. So if you have registered a custom domain in your Route 53, then you can use this page to map your custom domain names with the API gateway stage that you have created in stages, and you can map those particular things, right? So you do not have to actually go to API gateway stages and use this particular URL, right, which might change at a later point of time depending on the stage that you use. So you could easily have a Route 53 domain configured and then map that to your dev or QA stage accordingly, right? So that's an easier way to deal with the API. So to sum all of this up, what we are essentially doing is from the UI, we are making an AJAX call of type get with this particular URL and bucket name as the path parameter, which essentially goes to API gateway dev stage. You can see this is the invoke URL, and it basically maps to the get API of this particular resource. It goes to fetch S3 data lambda, which queries the S3 bucket that you have added in the path, and it will return all the files corresponding to that particular bucket and return it to your API gateway, and API gateway will return it back to your UI code. And again, like I had said before, it passes and simply shows it into the UI, right? So if you go to your web app, this is what happens. You can see that it basically does an options. Then it does a get, in which it gets a list of images in the S3. Then it gets get for each of the image and renders it in the UI, right? So I hope this makes sense to you all, the way we have done it so far. We first looked at how Lambda works, then we looked at how API gateway works, and now we have kind of integrated all of this so that as a web application, right? So in the next video, I'll show you how we can deploy whole of this setup as a CI/CD process so that we don't have to manually go ahead and upload the Lambda, and we will see how code build and code pipeline works. So stay tuned.